Hello and happy Friday. Welcome back, bookworms and flyleafs, to this week's episode of Author Reads here on Fae Production. I am your host, Fairy Princess Lily, and I am here today with Edward Willett. But before we jump into it, I want to, of course, get our things out of the way. So please like, subscribe, and today we're pranking the bell because yesterday was April 1st. So like, subscribe, and prank the bell for us wherever you happen to be watching from. And then also I want to give a shout out to this week's sponsor, which is That Witch Life podcast. And so if you are looking for a new listen about witchcraft, magic, spooky pop culture, and basically the witchy life, make sure to check out That Witch Life podcast. They are hosted by three lifelong best friends and practicing witches, exploring living as a witch in today's world. Lots of W's right there. Each episode features an interview with an expert from the witchcraft world, and some of their recent guests have included Stormy Daniels, Helena Garcia of the Great British Cooking Show, and Gabriella Hertic. And so wherever you can get podcasts, they are available. Their information is going there in the ticker, and it is in the low bar of the show, so you can find it before, during, and after the show. Please go check them out. They are an amazing trio of ladies. So with that said, now that brings us into our author today, Edward Willett. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Yes, so please, if you will, obviously barring your name because I've just said it, but if you would introduce yourself to our audience and tell us a little bit about who you are and what you write.
All right. Well, I write a lot of stuff. I'm the author of more than 60 books of fantasy, science fiction, and nonfiction for readers of all ages. I've written everything from science books for like the grade 2 level. I had to write a book about the Milky Way at the grade 1 to 3 level.
An actual textbook?
It's like a library book for an educational publisher. It's the kind of book that would go
wow.
into the library as a resource for kids who are doing school projects or something like that. What is the
wow.
Milky Way? And I've written everything from that up on the nonfiction side up to Genetics Demystified for McGraw-Hill. And then I've written a ton of computer books and a lot of children's biographies. I wrote a biography of Jimi Hendrix. I wrote one of Johnny Cash. I wrote one of Janis Joplin, and one of Andy Warhol. So I was really stuck in the 60s there for a while. But I also wrote one of the Ayatollah Khomeini. So, there's a bit of a contrast there. So I did a lot of that kind of educational nonfiction. I started as a newspaper reporter and photographer and then editor. But I mostly write, my first love is science fiction and fantasy. And I've got about 20 novels, I guess, maybe out from various publishers. My main publisher is Daw Books in New York, and I'm currently up to my 11th novel with them, and I'm writing my 12th, if I remember right. And then I've also published through smaller publishers, and then I also have my own publishing company, Shadowpaw Press, which has published some of the stuff that I didn't find home for, or I've killed a few publishers apparently because they died on me and the books came back to me. So fortunately, Daw is still there. I haven't managed to kill them yet. So hopefully that's not something I'm doing, but that's the way it feels sometimes.
Maybe they didn't actually die. Maybe they got written out of a different story somewhere and then they just ceased to exist in this realm.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure they died.
I don't want to laugh, but gosh, that's so shocking.
There's like three that I've been published by that then went out of business. So,
dang. Well,
one had been around for 40 years, and
that's a long time, and then they just poofed, huh?
Yeah, bankruptcy. Yeah, they just couldn't keep it going anymore.
It seems like it is an expensive endeavor, actually, based on kind of the number that you see sort of crop up and go away over time. I don't know very much about the financial side of the publishing houses that bring people together. So that's not my forte. But
let's just say I didn't start my company with the hope of making a fortune because I knew better.
Well, then why did you start your company?
It was an opportunity to publish some things that I didn't have a place to publish. I had two things in mind to begin with. Over the years, I'm not a prolific short story writer, but I have written some over the years. And I finally had enough where I thought I could put a collection together. And that's a really hard sell for somebody who's not well known as a short fiction writer. So I put that out first, Paths to the Stars, 22 Fantastical Tales of Imagination. And then the second thing I knew I wanted to do was this house that I'm in belonged to my grandparents-in-law, my wife's grandparents. They bought it in 1939 and then it's been in the family ever since. And one of the things that was in the house was my grandfather-in-law's First World War memoirs. He was a truck driver with the Canadian Expeditionary Force to begin with. And then he joined the Royal Air Force and became a navigator on a Handley Page bomber, shot down, finished the war in a prisoner of war camp. Late in life, he wrote his memoirs about that period. And I put them online originally without much editing. I just scanned them. Fortunately, they were typed and put them online. But I always thought if I ever started publishing more at a professional level, I would put out a book. And so I did. And that was the second book I put out, was One Lucky Devil, the First World War Memoirs of Samson J. Goodfellow. So that got the company off and running. And then I've had things that, as I said, were abandoned by publishers that went out of business, and I've put them out now through Shadowpaw Press. And then the other big thing was the anthology that I kickstarted last year, and I'm in the middle of kickstarting the volume 2 right now, called The Shapers of Worlds. And that's a short story anthology of the people who have been on my own podcast, the world shapers and the big names in the field. Bestsellers and award winners and all that kind of stuff. So that's why I started a publishing company, because I had stuff to publish.
Because you had stuff to publish in. So I'm curious, other than the original, excuse me, the original works that you used to kickstart your company there, what other kinds of things do you publish that you have trouble finding a home for? And I ask because this is the indie author industry. It would sound funny to say indie industry, but is sort of what the channel is about here, with the things that have a harder time finding a home. And I'm curious, other than the textbook types of things that you described earlier, or educational books, what do you think the difference is between the things that you have decided to publish on your own, and then, with authors that you bring on, versus the big publishing houses that you go through?
To tell the truth, I was just thinking about what I have published so far. Everything I've published so far was published traditionally and came back to me. However, I do have a book, and I have a book that's kind of ready to go. That would be actually the first one that I just published that had never been published in any form anywhere, except it's currently with a publisher, and I'm waiting to see if they're going to take it or not. So it's all ready to go. I have the cover art and everything, but then I thought, there's this publisher that might be interested. I think I'll send it to them first, so I'm waiting. But I do have things down the road. I know for sure, for example, that my current series with Daw is called World Shapers, and there's 3 books in that, but it looks like they don't want the 4th one, but I want to continue the series. So I plan to write that 4th book as soon as I finish writing the book that I'm contracted to write for my next book for them, which I'm working on right now. But the next thing after that will actually be the 4th book in this series that has had its run with a traditional publisher, but I want to continue it. So that's that may be the first thing I published that was never anywhere else. I do have some other things sort of tucked away that I will get to, but I'm a one-man operation, and it's amazing how much time it takes.
Well, when it starts involving other people, the herding of cats is absolutely a thing. So, hold on. I must remove what looks like a spammy spam comment. So, yeah, I don't know. Sometimes people get on YouTube and just do trollish things. So, and I caught that there. So, back to what we were talking about. Can you tell me a little bit about this anthology that is your Kickstarter?
Yes, I started my podcast is called The World Shapers, and I interview other science fiction and fantasy authors about their creative process. It actually started at the same time as my book series, World Shapers. Funny that. And because I've been in the field for a while, and I've gone to the conventions and I've met people, I was able to reach out to people, big names right off the top. So my first guest was Robert J. Sawyer, whom I've known for a long time, and John Scalzi, whom I've known for a long time, and Tanya Huff and Julie E. Shernada, who are fellow Canadians, like Rob Sawyer is too, for that matter. And then I just started emailing people, and people are willing to talk to me, which is great. So in my first year, I had just this amazing, Joe Haldeman and Victoria Schwab and Tad Williams, and, just amazing list of authors that I talked to. And a lot of them were willing to contribute either an original story or a reprint to
how cool.
an anthology. And what inspired it was, going back to Shadowpaw Press, at the annual meeting of the Saskatchewan Books, Sask Books, which is I live in Saskatchewan, which is a province in Canada. That's the association of our publishers. Somebody came in and did a presentation on kickstarting an anthology. And they had comic book connections. So they brought in huge amounts of money because comic people love Kickstarters. So I thought, hey, I know some authors. And that's what started the whole process. And so last year I successfully kickstarted, wait, it's here somewhere. Here it is. Shapers of Worlds, there it is.
Yes.
First one. And it had 18 stories, 9 original stories, and 9 reprints from some of the people I mentioned, David Brin, John Scalzi, me.
Well, I hope so. It's your anthology.
Yeah, exactly. I even interviewed myself in the podcast. My pseudonym, who wrote Bluefire, that I'm going to be reading from, interviewed me in my own podcast. He sounds a lot like me, but with a Southern accent. So,
interviewed yourself.
I interviewed myself. Yes.
You interviewed your pseudonym.
My pseudonym interviewed me. Yeah.
I feel like that's a podcast I want to go listen to.
It's been fairly popular, and it's very funny because he sounds just like me, but he talks a little bit like this. And I used to live in the South, so I can kind of put that kind of a sound on without too much trouble. And he said, well, now Ed, tell me about this book that you wrote. And I say, well, you see, it was a lot of fun. Anyway, so that worked last year, and as soon as that one funded, I thought, okay, I'm going to do it again. And oops, I did it again. I'm now kickstarting Shapers of Worlds Volume 2, which the Kickstarter's been running for 25 days, I guess, because there's 5 days left, 6 days left.
Okay.
And I was looking for 15,000 Canadian, which is far less US. And I'm 86% funded as of this moment. So you
only have you're basically there.
I think it'll be okay. Last time I was only 85% funded and there was only 3 days left and I overfunded. So there's usually kind of a surge at the end, and I hope that will happen again. This will be bigger. It has 24 stories in it, 18 original stories, and only 6 reprints this time. And again, they're the huge names, Kelly Armstrong, David D. Levine. As soon as I start saying the names, I forget them. That's the fun.
Like as soon as you say there are lots of names, all of the names scatter like cockroaches in the light.
Marie Brennan, that one came to me. There we go.
There you go.
Nancy Kress, Barb Hambley.
Onto it. Now they're like.
Yeah. Anyway, there's a lot of great authors, and I've already had some of the stories. And again, these are international bestsellers and award winners, and so it's going to be an amazing collection
of the anthologies.
What's that?
I presume there's some manner of theme for the anthologies.
Well, that's what sets this one apart. The only theme is that they were guests on my podcast. So rather than being a themed anthology, I think of it as a cabinet of curiosities. It's like an interesting box full of if life is a box of chocolates, well, if this anthology is a box of chocolates, it's like one of those boxes where every chocolate is different and you've lost the key, so you don't know what you're going to get until you eat it.
That's basically me with every box of chocolates. I lose those pieces of paper because they annoy me, and so...
So in the last one, I had hard science fiction, I had YA fiction, I had soft fantasy, I had humorous stories, and I expect it'll be much the same this way. So if you don't like one story, well, there's going to be another one coming along that's probably completely different. Yeah,
just keep on reading. So, yeah. Well, it's like the weather where I live. It will change in about 10 minutes.
Well, yeah, tell me about it. It snowed here twice in the last week, and today it's beautiful. So. Oh
my gosh, really? And where in Canada are you, if you don't mind?
Regina, Saskatchewan. So we're basically north of Montana, North Dakota. We're right above those two states.
North Dakota's cold.
Yeah, they're to the south of us, and we're in the extreme south of Canada. So, but it is the prairies. So I moved up here from Texas, which was also the prairies. And in northern Texas, there's a saying that there's nothing between you and the North Pole but a few strands of barbed wire, and they're mostly down. And well, we're that much closer to the North Pole, and there's even fewer strands of barbed wire between us and the North Pole here.
So what moved you? What decided to? I know it's not book related, but what made you move to Canada?
My dad was hired to teach up here. He was a teacher, and he was teaching in Tulia, Texas. in the public school, but he'd always taught, before that, he taught in Lubbock Christian College, and he wanted to teach in a Christian school. And somebody that he went to school with had contacted him, and they were looking for a music teacher, course director, at Western Christian College in North Weyburn, Saskatchewan, Weyburn is a town of about 10,000. Well, they said they were 10,000. They were more like 6. And North Weyburn was a little hamlet about 4 miles outside of Weyburn, where the former Commonwealth Air Training Command Base was, where they trained pilots during the Second World War. So we moved up here and found that we were living in converted army barracks, essentially.
Oh, wow.
And they've been turned into apartments and classrooms and stuff. My mom's took one look at the place and wanted us to turn around and go back to Texas. But we settled, and so I grew up in Weyburn, and I started my career in Weyburn as my dad taught there until he retired. He'd moved around quite a bit before that, but they really settled up here. And then I started my career as a newspaper reporter at the Weyburn Review and moved on to become news editor. So at the age of 24, I was the newspaper editor in town, and I did that for 4 years.
That's actually very cool, and I'm sort of curious about the journalistic aspect of your writing and how that plays in with writing not journalistic style content.
One of the great things about a weekly newspaper, which is what the Weyburn Review was, is that you did everything. Like I kind of had to be, they hired me as a sports reporter, which was nuts because I was not a sports guy. I played 1 year of high school football and that was it. I couldn't skate because I have flat feet, and not being able to skate in Canada or play hockey is like, so I was covering the hockey team and I really didn't care about hockey. But
didn't know anything.
But you do everything else. So I would write like 3 or 4 feature stories a week. I interviewed everybody under the sun. I interviewed entertainers. I interviewed preachers. I interviewed politicians. I interviewed people who had climbed Mount Everest. So you just interview everybody, and you cover everything, and you take pictures of everything. And I think it's just a great way to be kind of rooted in real life, I guess. And then when you're writing, well, what do you write about? You write about, they say write what you know. It's also what you can make up. But what you make up from what you know. So
yes.
The more that you fill your brain with stuff, the more stuff that you have to spew out onto the page in the form of a story. That was a disgusting metaphor, and I apologize for that.
More little tools in your seedling toolbox, right?
But you have to have stuff in your head in order to write. And one of the things about a journalist, at least the way I was trained, I don't know what the state of journalism now, I don't recognize it anymore really, but was that you don't know, you can't know everything, but you can know a little bit about a lot of things, and you know what you don't know so that you know what you have to ask questions about and how to get the information that you need. And I think that's a very useful skill. It ties into researching and just asking questions, because when I'm crafting a story, that's how it works. I have an initial idea, and then I self-interrogate. I ask myself questions about the story. Why did this person do that? Why is the society like that? If this is one thing that's true, then how does that affect something else? And that all ties into world building and character building and plot and everything else. So I do think it's been quite a good background to have. And the other good thing about it is that you don't have time for writer's block. The paper comes out when it comes out, and you have to write the stories that have to go into it, so there aren't blank pages. So you learn to just sit down and type when it's time to sit down and type.
That is actually an interesting perspective, because writer's block is definitely something that comes up quite a lot on the show. So, and will you tell us a little bit about what you're going to read to us from here today?
Sure. This is a story called Bluefire. It was originally published under my name, Edward Willett, by a company called Rebelite in Winnipeg, which is one of the companies that then died, hopefully not because they published me. So the story came back to me, and I hadn't really been thrilled with their way they had done the layout and everything. I kind of liked the cover art, but I didn't. They had, probably because they were operating on a shoestring, it was very tightly packed, and it didn't look inviting to read.
Right.
So I got a new cover. I rewrote it from start to finish, and put E.C. Blake on it, because E.C. Blake is a pseudonym that I wrote what's basically a young adult trilogy for DAW Books called The Masks of Agrima, Masks, Shadows, and Faces. It wasn't published as YA, but the character's a 15-year-old girl, and it takes place over about 8 months, so it's not like she grows up or anything.
Right.
So it's very much like what E.C. Blake writes, and so I put E.C. Blake on it. And basically, it just needs a little bit of setup. It's takes place in a kingdom where there are basically three groups of people. There was a war among the gods in the old land across the sea, and most of the gods were killed, but three survived, and they made a pact that they would leave people alone. They're basically some sort of extraterrestrials or something, but I don't really go into that. That they would leave people alone after giving them final gifts. And two of them had been on one side of the conflict, and the big gift is something called Bluefire. Bluefire is electricity, but it's controlled by magic. So it's magical electricity, basically. And they gave one, the god of the earth gave his priests blue fire, and it's generated by a god stone. So these cities built up around these god stones, and they're the city dwellers. The goddess of the sun and the moon, the sun, Erica is her name, gave blue fire, but they have what are essentially solar panels. They can generate blue fire from the sun scales that they put on these wagons, and they can carry it with them, and they can put up a defensive fence at night, kind of a glowing blue wall of electricity to keep out, things. And the things that they're trying to keep out, so they can move around. And the things, they're very gypsy-like. And the things they're trying to keep out are the night dwellers. Their goddess changed them completely. They only come out at night. They're basically feline, fur-covered, naked, fur-covered creatures. Very smart. They're humans. They just happen to be covered in fur and look like cats. That's just wishful thinking on my part, really.
Cat people.
I did some genetically modified cat people in another book, so it's clearly something that comes to me when I want to do something like that. So those are the three people, and there's three young people, one from each of these groups, and they have to work together to save their entire society when bad people realize what they can do with blue fire, and they're trying to blow down all the city walls and take over and wipe out the night dwellers entirely and all that sort of thing. So that's kind of the big setup.
All right. Well, I look forward to hearing this. Before I let you jump into the actual reading of the readings, just so everybody out there watching knows how things go here, Edward will read to us for a little bit from the book Bluefire, and then during that time, I will be on mute and in the chat audience with you guys, taking up questions. When he is done reading, then we will pose the questions to him that he might answer, and then we will have a drawing for a giveaway of Bluefire. Okay. Then I'm going to give you the whole screen, sir. Here you go.
Okay, now I have to put my glasses on and look older. It's not like I looked young before.
Distinguished.
And this is the book, Bluefire. There's so I'm not reading right from the beginning. At this point, the people I talked about, the sort of gypsy-like, have come to the city. Petra is a priest apprentice, and he's sort of seen them come in. Hamelin is a girl of these gypsy-like people, and she's a dancer. And we don't actually see the cat people in this. Sorry. So Petra has gotten himself into trouble with his friend, his roommate. His roommate tried to smuggle a girl back onto the grounds of the temple and naturally got caught, and they're both being punished. So they're on night patrol around the temple. And after that, I think it should be pretty clear. Chapter 3, this is actually The Gap. The night dripped, and Petra dripped with it. For the 14th time, he passed the gate where the guard had discovered the girl beneath the cabbages. For the 14th time, he met Court marching in the opposite direction. For the 14th time, Court's pace quickened. He didn't look at Petra. Petra looked at him, but somehow the water soaking his friend still failed to burst into steam. Then the night swallowed Court again, and Petra continued his endless, useless march around the temple, guarding it against entirely hypothetical intruders who would promptly be fried by the fire curtain anyway if they were stupid enough to try to get past it. In which case, his and Court's entire function would be to call for priests to cart away the charred bodies. Smaller victims they had to deal with themselves. He'd already picked up 3 cooked birds and a crispy rat, tossing them into the bins located at each corner of the compound for disposal in the morning. They take them straight to the cooks, the priest apprentices joked. At least, Petra hoped they were joking. If he were to touch it, the curtain would turn him crispy too, so he gave it a wide berth. It glowed on his right, a glowing, translucent wall of blue fire, hissing and steaming in the rain. Every 20 feet within its ghostly glimmer stood a thick square post of black wood. On the side facing the temple, each post bore a magical sigil, a complex symbol cut into the wood and filled with gold. From each end of a crosspiece atop each post hung a spark globe, a glass sphere containing a bright tongue of blue fire. Supposedly, the spark globes lit his path around the temple. In practice, especially in the rain, each illuminated only a small circle of ground, making the shadowed spaces between the posts appear even darker, the blue fire of the curtain itself being far too dim to light much of anything. Occasionally, the gloom was lit by distant lightning-like flashes from atop the dark bulk of the temple. All around City Primaxis, magical hearths took in that blue fire and turned it into the light and heat Petra was currently in such desperately short supply of. As he and Court passed each other at the gate, the rain redoubled its efforts to drown them. Even through the tin roof patter of the drops on his steel helmet, Petra heard the curtain hiss like a giant tea kettle. Vast clouds of blue-tinged steam rose from it into the night. The icy water poured over Petra's helmet and down his neck. Useless and sodden, his blue woolen cloak hung heavy as lead from his mail-clad shoulders. His boots squelched with every step. His damp leather trousers chafed his thighs. He couldn't even feel his fingers. They'd gone numb inside his soaked gloves 11 circuits ago. They'd be nice and toasty wrapped around Court's neck. The fact that Court was equally cold, wet, and miserable made his punishment a little easier to bear. Warming his fingers with a good long squeeze of his friend's throat would have made it a lot easier to bear. But the priests would make him do something even worse than this as punishment for murdering Court, although he suspected they'd have a great deal of sympathy if he resorted to violence. They all knew Court, too. He swiped his sodden arm across his runny nose as he rounded the bin into which he'd earlier tossed the burnt rat, started down the backside of the temple for the 14th time, and stopped. Perhaps 100 feet away, a patch of darkness interrupted the double line of spark globes in the steaming blue wall of the curtain. Heart suddenly racing, Petra blinked rain from his eyes. Spark globes did go black from time to time, the blue fire leaking through a flaw in the glass, but the curtain? Never. Which meant someone must have deliberately opened that dark gap to gain access to the temple. Someone who might still be inside. He wouldn't encounter Court again until he'd rounded the far end of the temple's long, dark rear wall. For the moment, he was on his own. He took a deep breath and started forward again, step by cautious step, grateful now for the rain, whose endless rush would surely mask the squish of his steps from any intruder. There is no intruder, he tried to tell himself. How could there be an intruder? The temple has never had an intruder. Court's fault again, putting silly ideas into his head. Once every third fortnight, Court received 2 days of leave to visit his parents, who ran the 3 Stones Inn by the Great Gate. Last time, he'd come back with his cousin's wild tale of naked dancing girls in the free folk camp, and an even wilder tale from a just-arrived traveler. Someone robbed the temple in City Pentaxis, Court had whispered in the dark as they lay in their hard, narrow beds after lights out. Robbed? Petra whispered back. And took what exactly? Nobody's saying. Petra shook his head. The traveler was just trolling for free drinks. My father is first keeper. He hasn't said. He wouldn't, would he? What if a thief stole a fire lance? That could start a panic. Court barely mouthed the words. The walls between rooms in the priest-apprentice's dormitory were notoriously thin, and the outrageousness of his words could earn him a beating, or worse. You know what I think, Court continued, barely audible? I think it's tied up with that Unbound cult. All those malcontents packing up and heading off into the wilderness, claiming they're going to start their own city. I figured they'd be night dweller food by now, but I'm starting to wonder. Petra had rolled over and said nothing more, but he'd stared into the blackness for a long time afterward, recalling the day a priest had demonstrated the use of a fire lance on a sheep carcass. He had learned many things about fire lances that day. He knew they could only be used within the city walls and a short distance outside those walls, perhaps a quarter of a mile. He had learned one of the great secrets of the priest of Vecran, that it was not the blessings of the priests that made the fire lances work, but their careful construction and the magical sigils inscribed on their wooden shafts, which meant that if someone stole a fire lance, that person could not only use it within any city, but also make more. Such a person would not be using the weapons on sheep. The thought of a living man reduced to charred meat the same way that carcass had been was the stuff of nightmares. There is no intruder, Petra told himself again as he drew almost level with the dark opening. If the priests thought there was the slightest chance anyone would break into the temple, they wouldn't have put me in Court, of all people, on guard duty, right? But even as he thought that, a low moan rose from the night beyond the curtain. Chapter 4, A Thief in the Night. Amlin spun across the stage to the wild, wailing music of the sun organ, finger cymbals ringing, bare feet and arms and legs flashing in the light. The ruby in her navel, the coins hanging from her scarlet breastband and headband, and the silver bracelets on her wrists and ankles glittered with every turn. The wide-eyed faces of city dwellers spun in and through and out of her vision, pale blotches in the light of the spark globes hanging above the stage. And then, as abruptly as a slap, the music ended. Amlin stumbled to a halt, panting, her skin wet with sweat that could not evaporate in the steamy air. In the sudden silence, she heard the steady patter of rain on the canvas high above. She smelled sweat and frying meat in her own musky perfume, and something else, the sharp smell of blue fire, the same nostril-stinging scent she had welcomed when Samarind activated the fence. She looked left toward Anija, who poked futilely at the red, yellow, and black keys of the abruptly silent sun organ. Then the spark globes flickered. Amlin looked the other way, toward the sun wagon hidden from the audience behind the painted curtain that created wings for the stage. In the uncertain backstage light, the wagon's sun scales glistened like wet stone. But somehow the sun wagon looked wrong. It took her a moment to figure out why. A black-clad figure, a living shadow, knelt atop it, tugging furiously at a sun scale with both hands. As Amlin watched open-mouthed, the intruder gave a final wrench and pulled the glass square free. Blue fire flashed, and the lights went out. Men and women shouted and screamed. Almost at once, tiny new flecks of blue light pricked the blackness as free folk rushed into the tent carrying light wands. But only Amlin had been in position to see the cause of the blackout. A thief stealing a sun scale, the greatest secret of the free folk, the gift of the goddess Erica. The first rule of the free folk flashed through her mind. When you see something that needs doing, do it. If she took the time to find a grandfather, the intruder would escape. Amlin leaped off the back of the stage into near-pitch darkness, alleviated only by a faint glow trickling through an opening in the back of the show tent, an opening that shouldn't have been there. With another jolt of outrage, Amlin realized the thief had sliced through the canvas to gain entrance. She felt her way toward that opening, half-crouched, her hands outstretched to keep from tripping over ropes and barrels and other odds and ends littering the backstage area. Even so, she banged her shin against something that boomed like a drum, carrying above the hubbub of the frightened audience out of sight beyond the stage. At the same instant, a dark figure blotted out the light in the sliced opening. He, or she, paused as though listening, then darted out into the rain. Less than a minute later, Amlin also emerged into the sodden night, shivering as water ran down her bare arms and belly and soaked her thin skirt, which clung to her legs like a second ice-cold skin. She shoved stringy tendrils of hair back up under her headband as her eyes darted this way and that. There, wearing a pack that surely contained the stolen sun scale, the thief, a man she could see now, hurried toward the blue glow of the fence. Except in one spot, there was no blue glow. Somehow he had sliced an opening in the fence, too, just as he had in the canvas of the tent. Terrified the gap would close behind him, Amlin dashed after him, her bare feet splashing through puddles. The intruder had only to turn around and he would surely see her, but instead he bolted toward the city. Amlin ran after him, heart pounding. She stumbled once and fell headlong, barely catching herself in time to avoid getting a mouthful of mud. She staggered up and hurried on. The intruder slowed as he neared the east gate. Again, Amlin glanced behind her. She could run back, call out to the guards at the portal, to grandfather, but by that time the intruder would have vanished into the city, taking the precious sun scale. Where? To the temple, Amlin thought with a shock of bitter certainty. To the cursed priests of Vecran. Who else? To prove her theory, though, she would have to witness the sun scale being delivered. And so, instead of running back to the camp for help, she ran the other way, toward the east gate, a single iron-bound wooden door standing open, framed by spark globes. The intruder entered the city unimpeded. The hidden guards didn't challenge Amlin either. With the free folk encamped, curfew had been extended and people could freely come and go. There was no way she would ask the guard for help. Reveal to the city dwellers that a thief had successfully stolen a sun scale from the free folk? Never. Samarind would skin her alive. She emerged from the dark tunnel through the wall onto the cobblestone street beyond. Ahead, the thief passed through the pool of light cast by a spark globe atop a tall wooden post. Amlin ducked into a shadowed doorway, arms wrapped tightly around herself, trying unsuccessfully to suppress her shivering. The thief paused and looked back. Amlin gasped. He couldn't see her while he was in the light and she was in the dark, could he? For a long moment he stood staring back in her direction. Then, abruptly, he turned and strode away. Amlin took a deep breath through chattering teeth and slipped after him. Don't do anything stupid. Don't get too close. Just watch. See where he goes, then go tell grandfather. She hurried on, avoiding the occasional spark globes, accompanied by the soft clinking of the coins on her costume, clinking she desperately hoped would not carry through the constant patter of the rain. Ahead and to the left, blue light flickered. The storm had brought no lightning. Those flashes could only mean she was getting close to the Temple of Vecren, and that meant her suspicions were correct. Those damned priests! When Grandfather finds out! When Samarin finds out! She dodged from doorway to doorway, her feet so cold that she couldn't feel her toes, though not cold enough to numb the sharp edges of paving stones. 3 blocks farther on, the thief slipped through a pool of light from a lone spark globe in front of a dilapidated 2-story building. He turned left and disappeared behind the dark, shuttered structure. Afraid she would lose her quarry, Amlin abandoned all caution and ran, jingling, as fast as she could. She pulled up short just before she reached the corner. Breathing hard, she cautiously peered around it. A high wooden fence ran alongside the building and well past it to the end of a short, unpaved street. A final spark globe at the end of the fence lit a small patch of green on a grassy field. Perhaps a quarter of a mile beyond that, a long row of lights cut through the darkness. Blue glimmered beneath those lights, and above them flickered the lightning-like flashes she had seen from the bridge. Each flash briefly delineated a hulking black behemoth of a building, the Temple of Vecren, and the thief was heading straight for it across the grassy field. Are they mad? Anger blazed so hotly in Amlin that it momentarily banished the cold nipping her exposed skin. Priests stealing the goddess's gift? The free folk wouldn't stand for it. They'd withdraw into the wilderness, city luxuries be damned. Trade would collapse, businesses would fail, citizens would riot, the kingdom could well fall apart. Amlin looked south and west toward King Stobor's palace, but could see only a faint glow through the mist. More than ever, she knew she'd made the right decision to come after the thief at once, by herself, without seeking help. She couldn't accuse the priest without being absolutely certain, and if the thief evaded her... She took a deep breath and slipped around the corner of the old building and down the short street, clinging close to the shadows of the fence. Then she made a final dash past the last spark globe into the open space surrounding the temple. The swish of cold mud beneath her feet gave way to the wet tickle of grass. She wanted to run, but she had no way of knowing what obstacles might lie before her, and so, with agonizing slowness, she walked across the black greensward. Wary of being silhouetted against the lights behind her, she crouched low, slowing her progress even more. All the while, she strained her ears, listening through the patter of rain for the footsteps of the thief, clenching her jaw to try to stop the chattering of her own teeth. She heard nothing. Wishing with every step she had the dagger she had trained so hard to use, the dagger she carried everywhere but on stage, she neared the temple at last, the lights resolving into a row of paired spark globes on tall poles. In the wagon link separating each pole and pair of lights from the next, blue fire shimmered, the priest's protective curtain, hissing and steaming in the pouring rain. She stopped just a few steps from that deadly wall. Shrouded in vapor, the curtain stretched unbroken down the length of the temple. Where could the thief have... Something struck the small of Amlin's back with bruising force. She cried out in shock as it hurled her from her feet. Her face slammed into the muck. She spat mud and grass, turned her head, gulped a mouthful of air to scream, and then choked on it as a gloved hand clamped her mouth, shoving her scream back down her throat. Sharp knees pressed into her back. Heart pounding like a caged bird in her chest, she waited helplessly for the bite of a knife with a sudden twist that would break her neck. Instead, the weight holding her down shifted, though the hand remained over her mouth. Lips and hot breath tickled her right ear. "I don't kill girls," a voice whisper growled. The thief turned her face back onto the grass and mud so that even though the hand slid away from her mouth, she could hardly breathe, much less scream. He tore at the hem of her skirt, and she heard it rip. She tried to kick him with her heels, but couldn't connect. A strip of cloth raked between her face and the ground, almost taking her nose off. It slid between her teeth and pulled tight, biting into the corners of her mouth. Then the thief pulled her arms back so far that her shoulders ached and lashed her wrists together. As his weight vanished from her back and she tried to kick again, he seized her legs and held them down while he tied her ankles together. Then he rolled her onto her back, face up in the rain, and disappeared in the direction of the temple. She sucked air through her nose, drawing so much rain with it that she almost choked. With a monumental effort, she rolled onto her side. By drawing her knees up and arching her back, she eased the pressure on her shoulders. She now had a clear view of the curtain and the black silhouette of the thief walking straight toward it. The blue fire will kill him. The thief raised his right hand. Something flashed brighter blue than the curtain. The glimmer vanished between two posts. Their spark globes blinked out at the same instant, and the thief walked through the gap into the temple grounds. With the curtain down, Amlin could see a deep-set door in the stone of the temple wall. The thief went straight to it and touched it. Another blue flash, and the door swung noiselessly inward. He disappeared into the darkness beyond, and the door closed behind him. Violent shivering seized Amlin. All but naked, she would die of cold if she lay there through the night. She strained against her bonds, but it felt as if she were pulling her shoulders from her sockets. Gasping with pain, she folded herself up again and stared at the opening in the curtain, trying to make sense of what she'd just seen. That was no priest. A priest would walk through the front gate. Is the thief stealing from the priests, too? Stealing what? And why? Amlin shivered helplessly on the cold ground, fuming at her own fecklessness. She knew how to fight. If she'd heard him coming, he would never have been able to render her helpless so easily. Before being allowed on stage for the first time, she'd been taught 6 ways to disable a man who made unwanted advances. She could outshoot many of the free folk men and handle a knife better than most. But the damned rain had foiled her senses, and that black-clad coward had knocked her down and trussed her like a beast without so much as a struggle. Footsteps pounded the cobblestones beyond the curtain. The thief, coming back? I don't kill girls, he'd said, but maybe he'd thought better of leaving a witness. She twisted her head around as far as she could. A figure in a blue cloak and steel helmet slipped through the light of a spark globe. A priest. Her heart raced with sudden hope. The priest stopped at the gap in the curtain. She strained to shout, but could only manage a moan against the gag. Still, the priest's head snapped toward her. His sword flickered from its scabbard. Then he stepped toward her through the gap in the curtain. And one final, very short chapter, The Girl in the Rain. Petra found his sword in his hand without remembering drawing it. The moan came again from beyond the gap in the curtain, and his hand tightened on the hilt. Someone was out there, hurt. But who? And who had deliberately deactivated a section of the curtain, and how? Magical keys, short wands inscribed with a golden sigil, could open sections of the curtain, true, but only the most senior priests had access to them. This could hardly be their work, which meant an intruder, a thief, had entered the temple grounds. Just like in Pentaxis, according to the traveler's rumor Court had whispered to him. And where was Court? Still trudging down the far side of the temple, oblivious to the curtain's failure? Or lying beyond it in the dark, moaning, injured after surprising the intruder? Or did that moan come from the intruder himself? Maybe he'd received a dose of blue fire, not enough to kill, but enough to incapacitate. Petra considered getting help, but by the time he ran back to the guard station at the courtyard gate, the intruder, if it was the intruder, might recover and escape. And if the injured person was Court, he needed help now. Petra stepped through the gap in the curtain with his sword raised. The moan came again, close by. There! A flicker of blue from the temple spire illuminated a long, pale shape on the ground. He hurried over and pointed his blade at it. Don't move! The shape remained motionless. As Petra's eyes adjusted to the dark, he realized it was a girl about his age, lying bound and gagged in the wet grass. She wore a short skirt, its color uncertain in the darkness. The cloth that gagged her and bound her bare arms and legs was apparently torn from its ragged hem. Silver bracelets encircled her wrists and ankles. Silver coins hung from the band of cloth covering her breasts. More coins glinted in her dark hair. A jewel winked from her exposed navel. Wide eyes stared at him. A free folk girl! Had the free folk somehow opened that hole in the curtain? Petra drove his sword into the mud, squished to his knees, reached for the gag, and pulled it free. Thank you, she gasped. My legs! You're free folk, Petra snapped. Why are you here? Are there more of you? I'm alone. I followed a thief. Another of your kind? Petra scrambled to his feet and grabbed the hilt of his sword. No! Her eyes rolled, white in the dim light. Petra tugged his blade free and stared around into the darkness, heart pounding, expecting an attack at any moment. The girl twisted her head toward the dark gap in the curtain. Listen to me. He's inside the temple. He'll be back any minute. He'll kill you. He'll kill us both. Cut me free. Petra looked down at her again, hesitating. She was of the free folk, heretics and thieves, the lot of them. But she was also a girl in trouble, and as a priest apprentice of Vecran, he had vowed to help the helpless. He swore. Then he shoved his sword back into the muck, knelt again, pulled the free folk girl into a sitting position, drew his dagger from its sheath, and cut the twisted cloth tied around her ankles. As he reached for her wrist, she screamed, "He's coming!" Petra jumped up, dagger in hand, and spun toward the curtain. A dark figure burst through the gap. The intruder held a long staff topped with a glass sphere which suddenly blazed bright blue. Petra barely had time to recognize the staff as a fire lance before the intruder pointed it at him and Blue fire flashed. Agony blazed through Petra's body. His muscles snapped rigid. Clutching his knife, unable to release it, unable to move, unable to breathe, he toppled like a felled tree. The black mud swallowed him whole. I'll stop there.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that. That was wonderful. You're a very, very good reader.
I do some audiobook narration too of my own, and I'll probably do that one at some point.
Yeah, that was very nice to listen to. You have a very good, nice, even-handed voice. Like good pacing, good everything.
Thank you.
So you're most welcome. So we do have a couple of questions out here, and it is 2:52, and I don't know if you pumpkin at 3 o'clock or if you can go a few minutes over. I can usually go a few minutes over. I don't pumpkin. So
I have a few minutes. Not too many, but a few.
Okay. So let me see here. I kind of like this question here. When you craft your characters, do you plan their growth arc, or do you envision someone and let them grow in ways that may surprise you?
Well, it's a bit of both. I tend to do. It's funny. These are the questions I ask on my podcast. These kinds of questions. I tend to do about a 10 single-spaced page synopsis, and it will talk in there about the general course of the way I think the story is going to go. And yet, at the same time, the characters do surprise me, and much of what I learn about them, I learn in the course of their adventures in the story. And it has happened to me more than once, where I've gotten to a certain point in what I thought was going to happen and realized it's not going to happen, and had to replot everything to the end. And a lot of that is because the characters have changed, or I've discovered something about them, or maybe I was 2/3 of the way through the story that I plotted when I suddenly realized what it was actually about. That's happened to me too. So it's kind of that mixture. Writing it's such a fascinating thing, that how much of it just kind of flows out of you, and you don't actually know what you've got until it suddenly appears, is what it feels like. So it's a very odd thing.
Because ideas sometimes also hit like that too, right? When you're in the midst of writing and you're doing a thing, your brain is also working on it. So it can be that you suddenly have an idea, and then maybe have to pause for a second or decide that this is the direction. If something was left kind of open-ended, right? And that can kind of wrap something up or take you in a place that you hadn't really formulated initially. At least that's how I would imagine that it kind of happens sometimes.
Yeah, and you don't know specifically what's going to happen until you start writing the scene. Like the current book I'm working on, I had certain things I knew were going to happen, and yet when I get to them, they happen in ways I didn't actually know were going to happen because I hadn't figured it out yet. And some of that comes from the characters. So it's all big, timey-wimey, wibbly-wobbly.
So I have a question that I wrote down myself here, and it's kind of related to what you were just saying with, sometimes you get to a place and then you didn't even know you were going to write that thing, or it goes in a direction that you weren't expecting. And I'm curious, what kind of tips and tricks do you use to find information? Earlier in the show, you had said that you don't, it's good to fill your brain with a little bit of knowledge about a lot of things, because if you don't know that you don't know, then you just can't do anything, right? So when there's a thing that you don't know about, how do you go about initiating a research process? You can't look up the definition for a word if you don't really even know that the word exists. You know what I mean? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Usually if I encounter something like that, well, I mean, these days I start on Google, right?
Yeah, right.
So I'm very good at picking keywords and trying to track down things. So, for example, I wrote a book called Duology, a space opera duology, again, for a publisher that then went out of business. And it had a rotating spacecraft in it. And at one point somebody was floating in from outside and was going to get into this spacecraft, which was rotating to make artificial gravity. I had to find out, okay, how fast do you need to rotate a ship that size in order to create that gravity? because I have to know how fast the surface is moving when this guy comes up to it from out here.
Right.
And somehow I found that. But yeah.
Although my understanding of that is that this is a very that does not actually work in order to create the artificial gravity. And if it does, it is at best very unstable. That's my understanding of those space station, that is. Like,
yeah,
this Babylon 5, maybe.
This was a gigantic ship. And when I looked at it, apparently it's only the rotation would be not too much more than a walking pace from the outside, would still give you a reasonable amount of gravity on the inside of the curve. So it was a very big ship, and that's all I needed was something like that. So
I'm over here thinking, is it actually creating gravity, or is it?
It's not gravity. It's
centrifugal force.
Yeah, centrifugal force, but it feels like gravity.
Yes.
We think, because we haven't actually done it. So.
Yes. Okay. Fair enough. We think it does. Okay. So let's see.
I wonder if it'd make everybody throw up. That's what I wonder.
Yeah. That's not a. Well, you know what though? I'm going to go with no though, because that's like the same principle as that carnival ride, the Gravitron. Which makes me
throw up. I just want you to know.
I'm like, of all of the ones, because for that one, of all the carnival rides, now I like stuff like that, so I don't really throw up, period, at anything like that. But of all the ones, that one I find not dizzying at all, because you are contained inside of it and your eyes don't have any stationary outside point to make you dizzy.
To be fair, I've simply avoided it because I assumed it would make me sick, because all the others do. So I guess I can't really speak from experience.
Fair enough. Let's see. Oh, here. Our science expert in the audience is telling us that the equivalence principle means that they are the same. I'm assuming we're talking about centrifugal force and gravity. It meaning they, when we say they, those things. Let's see. Sci-fi fantasy are often grouped together. I sense some sci-fi elephants.
Elephants.
So sci-fi elements.
That's my next book, Sci-Fi Elephants.
Sci-fi elements. There's so many ways that could go. Do you similarly have fantasy elements in sci-fi stories?
Yeah, it's funny. I always think of myself as a science fiction writer, but I've written as much fantasy as I have science fiction, maybe more. I haven't really done a count. But when I do write fantasy, I do tend to, for example, I wrote a book called Magebane, which was a fantasy. That was under another pseudonym, Lee Arthur Chane. But the magic, in order to do it, you had to have a source of energy. So you got magic from like natural gas furnaces and things like that, or coal furnaces. You drew heat energy, and that's the energy that you then transformed into magic. So, making a general wave in thermodynamics direction. And quite often I think in my science fiction, I don't typically have fantasy elements, but in my fantasy, I definitely have some science fiction elements. Now, my current series, the World Shaper series that I mentioned, reads like a fantasy, but it has a science fiction backstory. So it reads like a portal fantasy where my character is traveling from world to world, and each one is different. The first one is kind of like ours. The second one is based on Jules Verne. The third one is that just came out, The Moonlit World, is vampires and werewolves and peasants. Oh my. And the next one's going to be, that I'm planning to write and publish myself, is going to be like a film noir kind of Humphrey Bogart kind of world.
Oh, wow.
The backstory to this is actually involves super technology and aliens that once ruled the galaxy. So that's all way back in the backstory. And some of the characters are actually aliens, but it all feels like a fantasy. So I kind of mix and match on that side of things. But I would say in the stuff that I publish so in that sense, I suppose that's a science fiction story that seems to have fantasy elements. But is it fantasy if it all has a technological explanation? That's just Clarke's law about any sufficiently advanced technology being indistinguishable from magic. So I don't know. It reads like fantasy, but I think of it as science fiction.
Fair enough. I'm curious. So it is 3:00, and I know you only have a couple minutes. And so this is the point in time where I ask people to put their names into the comments section so that I can add you to the Wheel of Win before I spin for the book. So if you want to get your extra entry for today, put your name into the comments. The other way to get entries is to be a member on our Patreon and or a member on our YouTube. You can have a maximum of 3 entries each. So I'm going to give you guys the course of this last question maybe second to last question. I don't know. But what is the purpose of using pseudonyms?
It was strictly a marketing thing from the publisher. My first book with DAW was called Lost in Translation, and it was science fiction. Then I had 2 more science fiction books, Marseguro, which won the Aurora Award for Best Canadian Science Fiction Novel when it came out, and the sequel, Terra Insegura. But then they said, you know, fantasy is selling better right now. We'd like you to write a fantasy, but we'd like you to write it under another name so that you get a fresh start in the fantasy side of things. So I became Lee Arthur Chane for one book. That's the middle names of my 2 older brothers and myself, Jimmy Lee Willett, Dwight Arthur Willett, and I'm Edward Chane Willett. So Lee Arthur Chane. It's a great pseudonym.
So you get to choose your own pseudonym. In
this case, yeah. Okay. And then my next book was the E.C. Blake, because I switched from kind of a more adult epic fantasy to what was really functionally a YA fantasy with a 15-year-old female character. Said maybe initials, so unless people look close, if they wanted to, they could think you were a woman. So as long as you don't put your picture on them. So I did the initials, which are my initials, Edward Chane, EC, and then Blake is my nephew's middle name, Tory Blake Willett. So I became EC Blake, and I had 3 books under that. And then it was like, you know, my next idea could have been fantasy or science fiction. I actually pitched it both ways, and the editor said, let's make it science fiction. So that was The City Born, and I went back to being Edward Willett, and I've been Edward Willett since with DAW. But E.C. Blake and Lee Arthur Chane are established pseudonyms that I can now use on other projects if I want to. But it was strictly had to do with how they thought bookstores would be more likely to buy the books.
That's fascinating.
I mean, that's just one reason to have a pseudonym, but that was mine.
Yeah, no, I didn't really know that was a thing that was done. And so, I mean, I know that people have pseudonyms, but I didn't realize that I've never asked anybody that question before. You're the first person. So
I would say very often in traditional publishing, if somebody's publishing under more than one name, it was a marketing consideration of some sort.
They just think that will sell better, be received better by the audience or whatever.
Even in the case of Stephen King, you know, and his Richard Bachman books, he was so prolific, he needed a different name to publish some of his books under. So that's really a marketing thing as well.
Yeah, I guess because at that point, his name is his brand. So if you want to write anything different, people will assume those things together because they're indistinguishable. So, I
mean, some people pick them because they want to write something. They don't want anybody to know that they wrote it. I mean, that's obviously a time-honored reason for a pseudonym. But so far, I haven't written anything like that.
All right. So I've got our names from the audience, and I am going to pull up the wheel here. I've got them all entered into the wheel, plus all of our Patreon patrons and YouTube subscribers as well. So here's our big long list of people.
Wow.
Yay! Yes. So with that said, then let's see. I will hit the button and we will. Yes. I love doing this part. That is, what good luck is that? She literally won our drawing on Wednesday for, this is one of our Patreon and YouTube subscribers. So congratulations, Jay. You have won twice in a row now. So that is very cool. And for a copy of Bluefire here from Edward. So there we go. I'm like, I lost my tab. Where did you go? All right. Well, she'll be happy to hear that. So with that said, is there anything that you would like to say before we let you go today?
I just like to remind people of the Kickstarter that's running right now for Shapers of Worlds Volume 2, 24 stories from major exciting writers and some that you maybe haven't heard from, but you should. So Shapers of Worlds Volume 2, and the small URL is just tinyurl.com/Shapers of Worlds 2 with the Arabic numeral 2 will take you there, or just look up Shapers of Worlds 2 on the Kickstarter, and it runs till Thursday, April 8th.
I'm sorry. I guess I just got kicked from my own studio right there. But thanks. Good job. Just you just kept right on with that. So, and I guess I actually also have the link for your Kickstarter.
Okay, well that's good. I figured you did.
Yes, it is. It's in the low bar, and it was going also in the ticker. So I would suggest also, as a small reminder to people, with Kickstarter, if you are interested in contributing to that, but maybe now isn't the day, remember that you can go to the Kickstarter, you can click the little button that says follow or notify me, and that way, as the Kickstarter does come to its end, even though yours only has a few days left, so it is coming to its end, but it will remind you. It'll send you a little email reminder so that it doesn't fall off your radar entirely.
Yeah, I think it's 48 hours, I think, before the very end. Yeah.
I get them at 48 and at 24. And so at the ends of things, so because I love Kickstarter, so I kind of cruise it a lot. So
I've run 2 now. They're a lot of work.
They are a lot of work. I find it to be awesome because it helps people realize their projects. I find it to be a little frustrating because when already established companies use it to offset their costs for things, they basically just kind of transfer those costs for things that I think they traditionally would have been paying for, so because sometimes you see these Kickstarters produce just like these amazing ones, like amazing videos and all kinds of their graphics. And I'm like, the average person cannot do that. You know that this company already has the money to produce what they're putting a Kickstarter up for. And so that seems like a transference of cost to me.
Yeah. I'm basically just trying to get the money to pay the authors is what it boils down to. And then any money I make won't be until down the road when I've sold a bunch of books, if I manage to sell enough books to pay me for the hours and hours and hours of work I put into it.
Speaking of that, do you actually do conventions? And if so, do you have a convention that's coming up where somebody might find an author table for you?
Well, there hasn't been any conventions going on, but if they happen this year, I will at least be at World Fantasy Convention I wouldn't have a table, but I'd be there in Montreal.
Okay.
I do like the local Comic Con type things, but again, there hasn't been any. So
right.
Which is too bad. But I do a big table. I have enough books that I can do a very impressive table of books.
I believe it. How many did you say at the beginning of the show? 40, over 40. So that's
more than 60, but 20 or so novels, which is what is typically on the table. So
that is still a lot. So
and one poetry book, just for good measure.
You've done it all, sir. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show today. It's been great to have you and reading for us and everything. And seeing as how it's Friday, I wish you a wonderful weekend.
You too.
All right. Have a good one, and we will talk to you anon.
Hello, friends. This is Gunther Hammerhands. Thank you for checking out Fairy Princess Lolly's channel. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like and subscribe button. Use your troll hammer to ring that little bell icon to get notifications when she posts future videos. And if you'd like to support these magical creations, fly over to our Patreon and join the Faery family. Safe travels!